Behind these ancient walls that have seen centuries of execution and suffering, unseen hands reach out in the dark and phantom footsteps echo in the abandoned wings. Welcome to Shepton Mallet Prison. Come and sit by me as we get into the tragic stories of ordinary people executed for their crimes and meet the prison's many resident ghostly entities that lurk behind these bars. Hey, how are you doing today? Are you having a good day? Are you staying hydrated? Come on, you knew I was going to ask you that. If you're new around here, welcome. Hi, I'm Claire and I'm a lover of all things morbid, mysterious, and macabre. I've spent hours and hours absolutely enthralled in ghost hunting TV shows. But you know what I love more than all the night vision camera footage in the EVPs? I love the history behind a paranormal encounter, the origins of urban legends, and the real, raw, personal ghost stories that people experience firsthand. So that is what we're gonna do. Every week, we sit down and swap ghost stories like a good old sleepover. So if that is your scene, I would highly recommend subscribing so that you never miss one of our chats. Shit, I forgot to bring the books in. They were really good books as well, and I went through a whole thing to get them, so I'm gonna go get them. The first source that I leaned on for today's episode, I went to one of my favourite authors in the paranormal space, Richard Estep, and his book, Spirits Behind Bars. It was that book that also covered the Skirrid Inn, and in the second section of this book, it's his investigation in Shepton Mallet Prison. I also used the book From the Inside by Dave J. Cable, and it's a huge hardback book full of like records and just bits of history from the prison itself. And so it was great that I could actually get my hands on this book. And I actually just want to shout out Shepton Mallet Prison themselves as well, because I was looking everywhere for a copy of From the Inside. Obviously it's super niche, like it's a book all about the prison, like very specific. So I couldn't find the book, but I saw that in 2021, the prison themselves had stocked it in their like gift shop. So it was an outside chance. I just got in touch. I was like, can I buy a copy from you? And they posted it out to me, plus their guidebook as well, which has even more information and just like helps validate some claims that I saw on the internet. So thank you very much to Shepton Mallet Prison. But the book itself, From the Inside, I thoroughly recommend it. If you are in any way interested in going deeper into like the prisoner records and that sort of thing from earlier in their history, it's a great book that compiles like so much research and like photos of the prison as well. So for this story as well, there have been like loads of walkthroughs and guided tours with prison staff posted onto YouTube. So that was really excellent for kind of putting all the information together with the different locations around this absolutely massive place. So a special shout out to a little YouTube channel they're called like Memories of a Prison or something. And they basically went around and interviewed a bunch of former staff and like paranormal investigators. So that was a really cool find as well. And it's been ages since I last visited the prison. I think I last went for a wander around in like August 2018 time. But now I've done all this research and basically like lived and breathed the prison history entirely. I am so excited to go back. So anyway, those are my sources. I'll leave everything linked below in the description. And now come sit by me, grab your snacks, and we'll get into it. So today's story, I feel like I say this every time, but there is so much to this story, and there are a couple of reasons. So number one, this prison is 400 years old. So much history there. But also, it's known as one of the most haunted prisons in the world. Not just the UK or Europe, but the world. And so like that is a big, bold claim. Like there are loads of these places that claim like most haunted XYZ, whatever it is. So how true is it really? Well, first, obviously, like we need to understand just what's been going on here at Shepton Mallet Prison for the last 400 years. So the prison is humongous. It is this great big hulking campus that sits in the town of Shepton Mallet in Somerset. And it's funny, I didn't plan it intentionally, but it's actually a 20-minute drive away from Wookey Hole, which is the place we chatted about a couple of days ago. So you already know I'm going to say that you need to go check that one out after this, because that ended up being a story and a half as well. Just over here chatting your ears off this month. I hope your brain isn't leaking out your ears yet with all this information I'm throwing at you. So the thing about Shepton Mallet Prison is if you were to drive through the town of Shepton Mallet, you might miss it altogether. Like it is properly tucked away and it's got these great big stone walls all the way around it that are something like 4 feet thick and 75 feet high in some places. And this place, it actually was the oldest operational prison up until it closed in 2013. And I mean, that's like only 10 years ago that this place closed. Like, that is really not that long ago. But just imagine, like, if you were a prisoner, even in today's times, and you were pulling up to the prison in the back of the HMP prison van, and all you saw were these ginormous walls. Like, there is going to be all sorts of emotions going on there. The thing was, the prison that was operating 10 years ago was, fortunately for all the 200-ish prisoners that called the place home, it was absolutely nothing like the prison used to be. So back in 1610, King James I was on the throne, and if you were around for our chat about the Pendle witch trials, you will know all about this guy. He was the target of the gunpowder plot in England, which was basically an assassination attempt on the king, his family, and the Houses of Parliament. He was also a super religious Protestant and hated the Catholics and the witches, so he was out to get those too. Like, he was just like not down for any nonsense in his kingdom. So during his reign, he passed an act that said that every country needed to have its own jail. And the reason for this was so that there were houses of corrections that the undesirables could go to. We're talking your rogues, your vagabonds, your beggars, like those sort of people that needed punishment. And it's a common misconception that it was because of this act in 1610 that the prison was built, when actually it wasn't. Because you see, the county already had 2 jails in Ilchester and Taunton at the time, but it soon became clear that they were in need of a third, and so by 1617, they decided that they needed another jail more over to like the eastern side of the country. So in 1624, they decided on Shepton Mallet, the town, like, yep, that's where we're gonna go stick a bunch of criminals. So the powers that be, they bought the land for a humongous £160 off the Reverend Barnard. And just so you know, if you're as weirdly interested in these things as I am, £160 in those times would equate to around 32 grand in our modern English pounds, or 40,000 US dollars if you're that way inclined. And so they got to work building the first iteration of Shepton Mallet Prison, which was known as Cornhill back in the day. And so this was actually a corrections house, which I think is slightly different from like an actual straight up jail. So in these places, they would try and correct your behaviour, basically. Which sounds not that bad, right? Like a rehab unit or something like that. Yeah, no, this was not like that at all. Like the furthest thing from what it actually was like. Because in reality, it was disgusting. A literal hellhole. The cells that they built, they weren't like the cells that you would see in more modern prisons, like, you know, where inmates might share with 1, maybe 2 people. They used to lump 14 people into one dingy little cell. And any type of organisation, never heard of it, mate. Men, women and children would just be thrown into wherever there was a space. Murderers and rapists were locked up with kids that had just like stolen an apple to eat. It was absolute carnage. And they were all just so casual about it too. Like, they didn't really keep records of like who was in for what at what time or anything like that. Like, can you imagine it? Like, oh yeah, you're looking for Bob. Like, yeah, I think he's somewhere over there, I think. But I mean, in fairness, like, maybe not a lot of people could read or write back then, so that potentially could have had more to do with it. Like, what's the point in keeping records if you can't read them? Maybe, I don't know. But what we do know is just how awful this place was back in the day. And also, so you've got men and women, not separated, existing in these tiny little cells. Maybe they won't live very long, and so you may as well... Yep, you can already see where I'm going with this. So apparently plenty of kids were actually conceived in Shepton Mallet Prison, and it's probably fair to say that more than a few were actually born into this disgusting hellhole. But also back in those days, there was no social care like there is now. Say like if the father, the sole provider, got into debt and the family would be left destitute, the entire family would go into the jail with him. Or like if a single mother was put in prison, her kids would have to go with her. There was no one else to look after them. So some people were locked up in jail without even committing a crime. But I mean, like, think about it. Like, if you're facing a bitterly cold winter and you're a super poor single mother, what would be worse? Doing a little petty crime and getting you and your kids put up in prison with a roof over your heads? Or risk freezing to death and starving out on the streets in winter? I mean, you're risking death either way. Like, as I said, this place, it was horrific. You've got all these people cramped together in these cells. They're not going to be the cleanest of folk anyway. Oh yeah, and there are no toilets. So if you're super lucky, you might have a bucket that, get this, may be emptied once the contents were spilling out the sides. How lucky were those guys? And obviously with this complete ick that inmates were living in, I am sure you are not shocked to find out that disease was everywhere in the prison. The thing was, diseases don't care if you're a criminal or not. So nastiness like tuberculosis and typhus, which is actually known as jail fever because it was so common in jails like Shepton Mallet, these diseases would just spread through everyone in the prison, whether you were an inmate or a jailer. But of course, it was always worse for the inmates. One of the guide interviews that I saw, he said that during this time, if you were sent to Shepton Mallet Prison, your life expectancy would be 3 months. 3 months! And don't you go thinking that the jailers were going to go easy on you either. You were in prison to be punished, which is actually an interesting difference to prisons of today. So basically, if you get sentenced to prison today, you'll be handed down a sentence of like so many weeks, months, or like years imprisonment, and you'll go off to prison to serve your time kind of thing, right? Well, back in those days, being imprisoned, that wasn't the punishment. Being imprisoned was where they would keep you so that you could be punished. So if you were sentenced to like corporal punishment, like being flogged in the streets or something, you'd stay in prison until you got your back skin lashed off. Or if you'd been really bad and you were sentenced to death, prison would be where you would stay until you were gently encouraged into the next life. But those people, the jailers that were there to keep an eye on you, they weren't actually paid a fat lot at all. So, I mean, you can imagine the absolute apathy they showed towards these people. Like, I'm not being paid to give a rat's ass about your well-being, random inmate who'll probably be dead the next time I do my rounds. You know? They would turn a blind eye to inmate violence or even get blackout drunk and start beating the prisoners themselves for a fun thing to do to pass the time. Because jailers actually made their money from the families of the prisoners. And the arrangement kind of went like, hey, do you want your family member to starve or have to crap on the floor? Don't worry, I'll sort him out. I will chuck him some mouldy food in a bucket and maybe I won't beat him up. Or what's that going to cost? That'll be everything you've got. You're welcome. But they weren't complete animals. They did have a doctor that visited the prison. Not to tend to the living though, heavens no. If you were ill, you just have to suck it up and carry on. Or if you were gonna die, like hurry up and get on with it. Because the doctor was only there at the prison to confirm a death when prisoners had died. You know, like when they have to make sure that they're really dead before burying them and all that. And with the amount of disease and just general nastiness going on in a prison like that in the 1600s, there would have been plenty for a doctor to do. I don't think there are any records of official deaths from those times, but it's quite likely that any deaths could potentially have been buried in unmarked graves on the prison grounds. Because you weren't going to bury these indecent humans on consecrated ground, would you? That would be letting them off their prison sentence too early. Absolutely not. But it just seems that they just didn't keep any records back then, including who was actually executed during this time. It's kind of just like stories that have survived, like the one of two women, Jane Brooke and Alice Coward. So there were two women that were imprisoned in Shepton Mallet in December 1657 for witchcraft. Basically, they were found guilty of bewitching a young boy by giving him a cursed apple to eat and causing him to have these, like, seizures. There were apparently eyewitnesses to this bewitching, and it was on their testimony that these two women were sentenced to die. So some random dude stood up and said, yeah, I saw these two women curse that lad and he just fell down twitching all over the place. And that was enough to get you the death sentence. The worst part about it is, apparently the kid was a bit of a brat, and it is entirely possible that he could have made it all up to cover for the fact that he felt poorly after eating the apple. Like, what the hell? The two women were held in Shepton Mallet Jail, as it was known at the time, where Alice actually died. But I think that's kind of preferable to what happened to Jane. Well, actually, I don't know, considering the conditions of the jail at the time. Okay, so it was just horribleness all around. I think it's safe to say no one came out well in this story. When it came time for Jane's sentence to be carried out, she was tied to a stake and burned alive in front of all the villagers. Another absolutely heartbreaking story is that of John Dean. He was executed in 1629 for setting fire to two houses in Windsor. Did the fire result in anyone dying? I don't know. But the judge that was presiding over the case said that Mr. John Dean had shown malice, revenge, and cunning with setting fire to these two houses, and so he'd sentenced John to death. John was a literal child, no older than 9 years old. A 9-year-old kid that was executed. What the fuck? But by the early 1700s, like, the place had been going for 100 years at that point, and it had really built itself a stellar reputation for being an absolute disgusting pit of squalor. Like, it was nasty. Like, if you were sent there, you would be broken, both physically and mentally. Like, as a prisoner, you were just the lowest of the low. You were worse than the bucket of excrement that was festering in the corner of your cell. Like, that's how low down you were. And so you were treated as such. But by 1790, word was getting around about how bad it really was in places like Shepton Mallet, and the first of many prison reforms was starting around the country. So this did bring some improvements to the jail, and it started reforming away from being a complete cesspit into less of a cesspit, like a cleaner cesspit, but it's still, you know, like made up mostly of raw sewage. But they really were trying, and by the 19th century, it was time to expand the prison to add more unfortunates into the pit of misery. The Victorians were starting to bring around their prison reforms, so they'd begun to build new prisons while updating the older ones like Shepton Mallet. But they weren't ready to give the prisoners tellies in their cells just yet, because in 1824, they installed the treadmill as a form of hard labour given to prisoners. So hard labour was assigned to a prisoner because it was thought that by doing hard labour, sweating it out, like toiling over something, that was the way to reform a convict's soul. And also, it was a great way to break their spirits and hopefully deter other people from committing crime. Although I'm not super sure of the effectiveness of that bit. So the treadmill was basically like a giant stairmaster. You know those machines that you get in the gym where it's just like a rotating belt of never-ending stairs? That was the treadmill. This particular treadmill did actually have a use, as it was powering a mill on the other side of the wall, but that was kind of just like a may as well kind of thing. Just a happy little accident. Because the point was to keep the prisoners from being idle. It wasn't to make them productive. And so the prisoners could be assigned the treadmill as part of their hard labour, or they could be given other fun things to fill their time with. Like oakum picking, where you would take like gnarly bits of rope and unpick all the fibres, ready to be used again. Or the fan favourite, taking a hammer and beating rocks into smaller rocks. By the mid-1800s, Shepton Mallet Prison had been added to and extended so that it actually held over 250 prisoners at any one time. But it was still kind of like a general purpose prison at that point, and so in 1848 they actually built a specific wing to house the women and children to separate them from the men, and this would be the C wing. And with those wonderful Victorians, they kept all the records for the prison, so we know for sure what kind of things went on, including the fact that 7 civilians were hung inside the walls of Shepton Mallet Prison between the years of 1889 and 1926. Their bodies most likely would have been unceremoniously buried in an unmarked grave somewhere on the prison grounds. And so the reason that this would have been the case all the way back in the 1600s, so like from the time Shepton Mallet was built, was because they wouldn't have been able to have a Christian burial. They can't be buried in a churchyard because they're scumbags. But what I didn't know was that it was also in English law in the 1800s. So by this point, the Victorians had actually written it into their law that prisoners had to be buried on the prison grounds where they were executed. So we do actually know who these 7 men were that were executed. We know what they did to end up in Shepton Mallet and why they eventually had a date with a hangman. So the first guy, Samuel Raylands, he was put to death on the 13th of March 1889 for murdering a 9-year-old girl in a completely random and brutal attack. The thing was, the evidence against him was circumstantial at best, but because they had no solid alibi, they handed him the death sentence. So like in today's times, or like at least towards the end of the death penalty in the UK, he probably wouldn't have been executed. Henry Dainton, who was also known as Harry, he was hung on the 15th of December 1891 for drowning his wife in what was known as the Bath wife murder. This charming gentleman had a history of domestic violence against his wife Hannah, and at the time of her murder, he was actually out on bail after being put in prison for beating her. Eyewitnesses saw a man fitting his description drowning a woman that looked awfully like Hannah in a river. And so yeah, sure, it was purely coincidence that when the police showed up to arrest him later that night, he had dripping wet clothes in his house. Funnily enough, the jury took 12 minutes to find him guilty. Next up, Charles Squires was executed on the 10th of August 1893 for suffocating his wife's illegitimate 2-year-old son because he was making too much noise. I can't even with that one. But while these executions are going on, the prison is continuing to reform and evolve. And so now we're into the early 1900s. We're getting a bit more sophisticated, and in 1903, they actually dismantled the treadmill and turned part of the building into the infirmary. Look at that. The lowlives are getting medical treatment. You watch, it'll be PlayStations next, I bet you. But they weren't done with hanging the worst of the worst who entered through Shepton Mallet's gates, because there are still a few men left to go. On the 10th of November 1914, Henry Courtley was hanged after a nightmare neighbours from hell situation turned fatal. He'd been locked in this feud with a guy called Henry Pugsley. It was War of the Henrys. It eventually culminated in Courtley ambushing Pugsley and shooting him in the back with a double-barreled shotgun. Pugsley's wife was able to drag him into the house, but he bled out after receiving more than 100 pellet wounds. Courtley, eventually seemingly realising what he'd done after the red mist had lifted, tried to kill himself with the same gun as the police came to arrest him, but he whiffed and ended up taking out a chunk of his lip and the ceiling above it and nothing else. A guy called Vernie Assar. He was a private in the Australian Army Service Corps who was stationed over in the UK for the First World War. He was rooming with a guy called Corporal Joseph Harold Durkin when one day Joseph was found dead. It was just initially passed off as a suicide, but it eventually came out that the two men were love rivals, and Vernie had shot Joseph with the rifle that was laid on top of his body. Vernie tried the insanity case, but he eventually met the hangman on the 5th of March 1918. The next man that was condemned was a guy called William Bignell. He was seeing this woman called Margaret Legg, who was a married woman, but they were consenting adults getting up to some extramarital affairs. Apparently, he caught a venereal disease from Mrs. Legg, and obviously he was humiliated, broke up with her, and went and enlisted in the army, because this was the First World War at the time. But she wasn't done with him. She just loved her little bit on the side, and she kept writing to him while he was away fighting. They came up with a plan to run away together once William got back home. Once he returned, they did just that, and 2 days later were witnessed drinking in a pub together. That night, William cut Margaret's throat with a straight razor and left her body in the field where he'd murdered her. The thing was, William actually went and admitted to the police what he had done, so that was something at least. Didn't save him from the noose though, so maybe don't cut your girlfriend's throat in the first place. So the last man to be executed was a guy called Ignatius Emmanuel Nathalie Tebish Lincoln, who was also known as John. John was apparently doing a bit of Christmas Day burglary and had gone into his target armed with a pistol. Thing was, he didn't expect the homeowner, Edward Charles, to also be armed with a pistol. So there, Edward Charles is trying to defend his home. He fired at John and his accomplice, and apparently John panicked and fired quote-unquote warning shots at Edward. Only thing was, one of these warning shots hit Edward in the chest. Edward lurched forward, in a last sort of bid to get these men out of his house, possibly if he didn't actually realise how badly he was hurt. But John smacked Edward around the head with a glass bottle that was nearby and left the man to die on the floor from his gunshot wound. But I'm sorry, who goes around burglarizing on Christmas Day? Even back then, surely Christmas Day was probably the one day you could count on people would actually be at home, not at work or something? Although maybe he thought they might be out at church. I don't know. Either way, this Christmas time activity landed John in Shepton Mallet Prison, where he was executed on the 2nd of March 1926. And that marked the end of the civilian hangings at Shepton Mallet. And even though there were only 7, that is still 7 times that prisoners went through these super intense emotions before crossing over to the other side. That kind of trauma that occurs on the grounds of a prison, that's gonna give you ghosts if you're not careful. But overall, the prisoners seemed fairly happy, dare I say? As happy as prisoners locked in prison can be, I guess. I mean, the ones that weren't being executed, obviously. The reason I say that is because in 1904, there was actually a fire in C Wing started by one of the prisoners that spread fairly quickly, as it was a pretty blustery day that day. However, it was because of the prisoners working alongside the prison officers and the fire brigade that the damage wasn't nearly as bad as what it could have been. No one was killed or even injured, and even more surprisingly, no one attempted to escape. The prison population had been free-falling though. The last woman had been transferred out by 1918, and by 1930 there were only something 50 male prisoners knocking about the whole site. So this tiny population in this huge prison, alongside the fact that maintaining a prison at that size and age was super costly, they decided to close the prison later that year. And I'm assuming it just stood empty for 9 years until 1939, when the British military took it on and reopened it at the start of World War II as a military prison. It was known as the Glass House, and it was actually super important, as Shepton Mallet was chosen as the place to safely store those like priceless national treasures like the Doomsday Book and the Magna Carta. I mean, like, London was getting lit up by the Luftwaffe in the Blitz. Like, they wanted to make sure that all of these like priceless and completely irreplaceable archives also weren't blown up by the bombs. And so that's a claim to fame for the Sea Wing, that it used to house all of these precious archives. But that wasn't all the prison housed at the time, as it was still a working military prison. It housed the defaulters from the British Army, Navy and the RAF, as well as a few conscientious objectors. So these were the people that, for like moral reasons, refused to serve in the forces or like wouldn't hold a gun or anything, because back then that deserved a prison sentence. And so these weren't hardened criminals. There were no executions carried out during this time. There were, however, 3 tragic deaths that took place. On the 13th of December 1940, 4 soldiers were occupying cell 142 on B Wing. Now, at that time, the prison was heated using gas burners, which was controlled by prison officers, like outside the cell. Just so you know, like, prisoners can't be messing around with it and trying to cook themselves alive or something. And it's December, it's the depths of winter, so like they're using these gas burners to keep prisoners warm, obviously. So the soldiers in cell 142, they'd gone to bed, no issues that night, and they were checked on multiple times in the night. They were fine, they appeared to be sleeping, which is what you'd expect them to be doing at night. It wasn't until the morning after, at 6 a.m. on the 14th of December, that it soon became clear that something had gone very, very wrong. The officer in charge was banging on the door to wake the soldiers up, but he was getting nothing back. Bit weird. They went into the cell and they could see by the looks on the men's faces that things were not okay. Turns out the occupants had been breathing in carbon monoxide all night from the gas burner. 3 of them died from carbon monoxide poisoning, while 1 luckily survived. Later on, a Sergeant John William Ernest Hill went on to say that, yeah, there was a, quote, queer odour in the room, not the ordinary smell of coal gas. Obviously, this got the higher-ups like super heated. Like, how in the hell was this allowed to happen? The cell had been used before it was technically, officially certified as safe. Like, it didn't have enough ventilation, and that was why the carbon monoxide had built up to basically lethal levels. And so it was gross negligence that had led to 3 men losing their lives that night. So that wasn't great. A few years after this incident, in 1942, the American military decided that they wanted a slice of Somerset heaven for their deserters, criminals, and general lowlives. And they had some real charming characters stay here. Between 1942 and 1945, they had over 700 soldiers imprisoned here. And they actually ended up executing 18 of them. Because alongside the American defaulters, they also imprisoned soldiers that had committed civil crimes while stationed over here in the UK. So, you know, like those worst of the worst kind of crimes. 2 were executed by firing squad, and you can actually see where this happened against the prison wall. So over in the far corner, like on wall 5, I think it's out like the back of the chapel, I believe, you'll see a patch of wall, and from a distance it looks pretty normal. But as you get closer, you'll see something a bit off about it, because it's got a really grim reminder of exactly what the wall was used for. You can actually see exactly where the bullets hit the wall. Like, there's patches of like rust where the bullets have corroded over time, and you can see where some have like ricocheted off and like chipped bits off the wall. Apparently, for one of the executions, they forgot to put sandbags behind the guy, you know, like to absorb the bullets and like stop them from pinging off the wall. And because of that, apparently one of these bullets ricocheted off the wall and hit one of the firing squad right in the chest, like seriously injuring him. And it's pretty sobering looking at the wall, to be honest, like just knowing what happened here, like how 2 men died against that wall. It kind of just brings everything into perspective a little bit of just how hellish it was being in prison. And just as a side note, along that wall, wall 5, there are some patches of tarmac that look like they were like recently resurfaced. You know, when the council will only like repair patches of the road instead of doing the whole thing, like kind of like that. And the reason for that is because when the prison closed down in 2013, plans actually got approved for the prison to be turned into housing. So when the developers came to survey the site, they had to make a few digs and sort of like see what they were working with, I'm guessing. And while they were digging in this area, they came across 7 bodies buried in completely unmarked graves. Thing was, there's nothing you can do. You're not allowed to move them for 100 years unless you take a petition like all the way to Parliament and then to the King to get them moved. So they just had to cover them back up and tarmac over them. So the other 16 American prisoners that were sentenced to die, they were going to be hung. And so now it's kind of been the story for the longest time that it was these Americans that actually decided that the existing scaffolding that was somewhere on the prison site clearly wasn't good enough. And that it was the American military that built this new like red brick building that you can see today that was to become the place where they dispatched the prisoners that were sentenced to die. It wasn't until David Cable, the author of the book From the Inside, he actually looked into it and he found out the truth. Because it spouted off online that it was like, oh, the Americans built it, and that was just the accepted story. But it's not actually the case. He found that the red brick hanging shed was built sometime after 1906, but was definitely up and running by 1914, as that's where the Wells Journal, a local newspaper, reported that Henry Courtly was executed, which was way before the Americans took over. And that's the brilliant, if a little infuriating bit about history, isn't it? Like, you'll believe something to be the truth for so long as that's just what it's always been, and then new evidence will come out and it like completely changes the story. It just makes you think, doesn't it? Anyway, so this hanging shed, it was completely purpose-built. It had the trapdoor built right into the floor, and it had the condemned cell right next door. So the execution room itself is pretty unassuming, like not the dramatic scene you might picture, save for the big old trapdoor in the middle of the room. Like, it's pretty mundane. Obviously now it's got like public information cards like all over it for the visitors, but you take them away and other than the hulking great big trapdoor in the floor, it doesn't really look like the sort of room that you'd imagine where convicted criminals were put to death. But it most definitely was. So the condemned prisoner would spend his final few weeks in the condemned cell next door, reflecting on everything that had led up to this point. Like, maybe he was full of regret about how things played out. Maybe he was angry that he got caught, or terrified of how it was going to feel. Like, what was it going to be like to die? There's an awful lot of twisty little avenues your brain can take you down when you're left alone with your thoughts, knowing what's about to happen to you. Although I guess the condemned prisoners were never really alone because they'd be under constant watch by the prison staff. We don't want them killing themselves and getting out of being killed by the hangman, am I right? So the condemned cell was a little bit bigger than the cell that's mocked up now, like they've sort of added a wall to partition it, but you get the idea. There would have also been a big old bookshelf covering one of the walls. What the condemned prisoner didn't know though was that apparently in the cell opposite him, the hangman would arrive the afternoon before the prisoner's execution, and so he would stay the night in the cell opposite the condemned. And just on the hangmen themselves, they weren't these like bloodthirsty barbarian executioners with the black hood over their head kind of thing. The man that was appointed as kind of like the go-to guy for executing the Americans at Shepton Mallet was a man called Thomas Pierpoint, who had got into the necktie party game through his brother Henry. And it was Henry's son Albert who is thought to have assisted Thomas in at least 6 of these hangings. Like, it was a real family affair. I mean, there really isn't going to be too many ways of getting into hanging people as a career choice, are there? Like, could you imagine the LinkedIn job posting for that one? But these were highly trained men that had learned and developed their skills enough to dispatch the condemned men as quickly and as painlessly as possible. Like, they were there to do a job and they weren't going to lose any sleep over it. So when it was time for the prisoners to meet their maker, the bookshelf would be opened, revealing a secret door into the execution room that the prisoner would have had no idea about. And if this was a British man before the Americans came, the prisoner would come out of his cell, step on the spot on the trapdoor, and be dispatched within seconds. Like, 20 seconds was a long time. Like, it would have usually been much less than that. Like, it's quick, clean, there's no time to fuss or get worked up about what was going to happen. Which I think if you're going to do it, like, that's a good way to go. Like, it's done before you even know what hit you kind of thing. But if you were one of the American soldiers put to death, ugh. So it was the American law that the condemned man, again, would be led out of his last cell into the execution room to be made to stand on the trapdoor. But he would then be read all of the things that he was charged with, his sentence, and then asked if he had any final words he wanted to say. Like, some prisoners would be standing there with the noose around his neck for like 6 minutes, just sweating beads, waiting for the inevitable. Albert Pierpoint, one of the executioners, even made it pretty clear in his autobiography just how sickened he was by the American way. Like, how brutal is it though? Like, it's so unfair. You're just there waiting for the inevitable. This guy is droning on. Oh my God, just get it over with already. Please. After the lever had been pulled and the prisoner's neck had been broken, the body would be left there for an hour to hang before being cut down and transported to the morgue. Once the war ended in 1945, the Americans packed up and went back home, and Shepton Mallet became a British military prison, a glass house again. And it was at this time in the prison's life, 1952, when the Mallet, as it had come to be known, became home to, I would say, its most famous prisoners, Ronnie and Reggie Kray. So I'm sure you already know who Ronnie and Reggie Kray are, thanks to the likes of Tom Hardy. But in reality, these guys were the OG godfathers of crime on the East End. And the reason that they'd ended up in prison at that time is because they'd been called up to do national service. And that was basically like after World War II, like from 1949, all healthy men aged between 17 and 21 had to do a mandatory 18 months in the army. So in March 1952, Ronnie and Reggie Kray received their letters calling them up to the Tower of London to start their service with the Royal Fusiliers. They lasted minutes. Apparently they were being given the initial lecture on smart turnout, like how to look presentable, and they were just like, nah, you're alright, not gonna tell us what to do. And they started walking away. The corporal went to stop them, kind of like, where are you going? This isn't an optional thing. And Ronnie clocked him straight in the jaw, and they carried on walking back home. They were then arrested the next day for being officially AWOL, which is absent without leave. And so they were actually some of the last few prisoners that were ever held in the Tower of London before being transferred to Shepton Mallet. So while they were at the Mallet, they moved around a lot, like unsurprisingly. They got in a bit of trouble now and then. And from the stories that have been passed down, they may have been held in A Wing and segregation, and then C Wing too. And they don't really have a specific cell, because every time you'd get into trouble and be moved into seg, your cell would be given to another inmate who needed it, meaning that when you came out of seg, like they would have to find you a space somewhere else. So they would have been moved around a lot and apparently wouldn't have been housed together. Like you can probably imagine it's just not good for anyone having them scheming day and night together. It's also thought that this is where the Krays would meet Charlie Richardson and George Cornell, who would go on to become the Krays' like main rivals. According to Charlie Richardson, they actually all got on really well in prison. They had like a decent laugh together. They had a similar sense of humor. Like things seemed to be going all right while they were all at the Mallet together. But if you know anything about the Krays, you know that it clearly went all downhill very quickly, as George Cornell would be shot point blank by Ronnie Kray in the Blind Beggar pub in 1966. But 1966 was an important year for Shepton Mallet Prison too, as this was the year that the British military moved out and it became a civilian prison again. The year after that, in 1967, the execution room was sitting unused for a fair while by this point, so they actually turned it into a library. Just watch out for the trap door on the floor, I guess. But in all honesty, like this was probably a fair bet. Like the death penalty in the UK had been suspended in 1965, and it was looking like it was heading towards being abolished, which it eventually did in 1969. In 2001, Shepton Mallet Prison became a Category C lifers prison. And so that means that the prisoners are like coming to the end of their life sentence. Like they're getting ready to release them back out into the big wide world again. But that's not because they're coming to the end of their life. They're not like gonna die or anything. It's because their sentence is for life, but their imprisonment is not. So lifers can actually be eligible for parole after they've served a minimum amount of time in prison. And also the parole board is like happy they're not going to go straight back to killing or whatever it is that got them in prison in the first place. However, the lifers that are released from prison will stay on license for the rest of their life. So that's where like the actual life bit comes in. And this means that they have certain conditions that they have to meet for the rest of their life. So like meeting with probation officers or like not leaving the country without permission and all that. So the only people that will actually serve their whole life sentence in prison are those that are given a whole life order in the UK. Like they will never be eligible for parole. They will never get out. So you know like that nurse Lucy Letby that killed all those babies, like she was given a whole life order in August. I mean she was given like 14 of them. Like, she is never getting out of prison. So Shepton Mallet Prison was not for those sorts of people. It would have held murderers and rapists and the worst of the worst that were handed life sentences, but they would have been the people coming to the end of their minimum amount of time served in prison, ready to live the rest of their life on license. Make sense? And so from interviews with the prison officers that were working at Shepton Mallet, it seemed like a fairly decent prison as far as prisons go. Like, obviously, there were still attempted escapes and violence and all of that, but overall, the prison officers that I heard from, they kind of look back on their time quite fondly. So it would be really interesting if you were a prisoner that served time at Shepton Mallet. Like, what was it like? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Like, I guess hearing the story from the other side, that would be really interesting. However, it doesn't matter how quote-unquote nice a prison appears to be, it's still a prison at the end of the day. It's still a place that takes prisoners to the darkest corners of their mind, the fear, the depression, the I just can't do this anymore kind of feel. And so suicides did happen in the prison, with one prisoner taking his life as recently as 2011. He was found the morning after he'd done the deed at like first rounds kind of thing, hanging by a shoelace, tied to the window bars of his cell on the 3rd floor of B Wing. There was also another suicide back in September 1917, where a prisoner ran up a 14-foot ladder that was in the exercise yard and basically jumped off it, and he died the next day in the prison infirmary. And so for almost a century after that suicide in 1917, Shepton Mallet continued to house prisoners that were doing their time and working towards their release. But like all things, they come to an end. And I mean, at almost 400 years, like it had a good run. The prison was finally decommissioned on the 28th of March 2013 in a ceremony held on the exercise yard, where both past and present officers and staff like got together one last time, like along with a bunch of other people. Now, it's a tourist attraction where you can walk around, get guided tours of the place, or hunt a few ghosts, if that's the sort of thing you're into. And it's even been used for filming like Paddington 2, and it was actually used for the prison scenes for that miniseries Dares, you know, where David Tennant played Dennis Nielsen, that serial killer that murdered like a bunch of men and boys in the 70s and 80s. Highly recommend. I actually gave that a watch while doing the research for this story, and oh my god, little Bleep the dog. My heart could not take it. And so we've talked all about the history. I don't really feel like I've got quite across to you the sheer size of this place. Like, it is massive. And wouldn't you know, it's had reports of paranormal activity in just about every corner of the prison. So the prison as it stands now, and obviously how it was when it closed in 2013, is made up of 4 wings, A, B, C, and D wing. And over its almost 400 years as a prison, it's obviously changed dramatically. It's been added to, they've added like new wings and buildings and whatnot. The old prison from the 1600s is now actually buried underground. So when you go walking through the exercise yard, you're actually walking over the old cells. Basically, when they remodeled it, they just flattened the old cell blocks and just left the rest underground, and then just tarmacked it when they built the wings around it to make the exercise yard sort of like completely enclosed. You know, like less chance of prisoners escaping if there's buildings on all sides of you kind of thing. One of the women that investigated Shepton Mallet along with Richard Estep when he was writing his book was a woman called MJ Dixon. Now she's got a bit of what you would call the gift. So when they were walking through the exercise yard, MJ kind of thought that she could sense people like lined up in rows under the ground. So obviously like she's sensing rows of people underground like that. You just assume that they're like bodies buried, right? So they were absolutely shocked when they found an old map of what the prison would have looked like before they built the new wings, and saw that all of those rows of people would have been prisoners in cells. Like, how creepy is that? There is also a very real reminder of what the prison would have looked like in the 1600s, as when the developers were going around like knocking holes in walls as part of their plans to build houses. I don't know how they did it, why they did it, but they did. It's literally just like behind a wall and you have to crawl on your hands and knees to get into it. But then once you're in there, it's just like this tiny little wood panelled room. 0 out of 10 do not recommend if you are claustrophobic, and do not even think about how it would have been used back then with as many prisoners as possible crammed into the cell with you. But let's talk about where prisoners would have lived up until the prison closed, starting with A Wing, which is funnily enough known as the most haunted wing. Although from reading all the materials and listening to all the interviews, it kind of sounds like it depends who you speak to as to what their opinion is of where the most haunted spot in the prison is. This wing was initially opened in 1825 and has really built up a reputation for itself over the years. It seems to be connected with one of the most famous ghost stories in the prison, the White Lady. So the White Lady has been seen all over the prison, manifesting as a kind of like vague, nondescript, kind of your standard issue female in a white dress kind of thing. But if you try and approach her, she vanishes. The story goes that she was a prisoner that was sentenced to be executed for murdering either her lover, her fiancé, or her husband. like one of the three. And so this was in the 1680s. So this was like the heyday of public executions. So she was just held at Shepton Mallet before she'd be transported into the town for everyone to watch her swing. The night before her execution, she had asked to wear her wedding dress for the night. You murdered the guy. Like, you could have been wearing your wedding dress for an entirely different and much happier reason, but okay. Apparently, the morning of her date with the executioner, the cell door was swung open and she was stone cold dead in her bed. There were no marks on her body, no apparent suicide attempts, nothing. And so they concluded that she must have died from a broken heart. I don't know, I'm gonna sound like a broken record here, but don't kill the guy then. Even so, centuries after all this went down, she's still not left the confines of the prison, and while she's seen in multiple spots on the site, she seems to love the A-wing the most. She sometimes manifests as that full body apparition, but if you don't see her, you'll sometimes get the waft of like a sweet smelling perfume that's said to be her. Alongside her, there is said to be a child which haunts A-wing, which makes sense considering the amount of children that would have been held here back in the day. People have also reported hissing as they walk past cells, but obviously no one's in there. And that one's a weird one. Like, that's pretty hard to mistake for like a building settling or anything like that. Moving on to B-wing, which is the largest wing in the prison. And to be honest, by the looks of my research, unless I'm missing something glaring, I feel like B-wing has more activity than A-wing, but I don't know. The reports even go so far as to say that like individual cells have been reported as being active within this wing, with people saying that in cell 1, the door will commonly slam shut and the cupboard doors will swing around with no explanation. Cell 8 even had a reputation back when it was a working prison, as inmates would complain to the officers about being locked up at night in it. They would beg to be moved, claiming that they could feel this immense pressure on their chests at night. Which, yeah, that is absolutely terrifying. Like, as if prison isn't stressful enough. Now you're gonna have to deal with ghosts sitting on your chest at night. Like, no thank you. And this story was really interesting. So apparently, it was at night, the prisoners were locked up for the evening, and the officers were like in the office. All of a sudden, all you can hear on the wing is a prisoner banging the hell out of the door, screaming to be let out of the cell. Obviously, this doesn't just sound like a normal messing about, like this guy sounds scared. So they rush out of the office and go over to the cell where the banging is coming from. They opened up the door and one of the prisoners just rushed straight past them and went and stood in the furthest corner of the wing. There was another prisoner lying motionless on the floor. Obviously, they're wondering like, what the hell has gone on here? Like, has that prisoner just killed this one? Like, what's going on? They got the guy up off the floor and he was fine, but he did ask, is the woman gone yet? I'm sorry, what woman could you possibly be referring to in your cell in the middle of the night in a male prison? He replied, the lady that came through the wall and sat on my bed. Excuse me, no. Turns out both of these inmates had seen a woman, and that's why one of them was as far away as he possibly could get from the cell. Like, that is just so much worse, isn't it? Like, okay, doing a paranormal investigation and calling out to ghosts and whatever, that's fine. But to actually be locked in what I would say would be fairly close quarters with a ghost that you did not sign up for, that is something else entirely. And also a very interesting story that sounds awfully like it could have been an encounter with the lady in white. But that's not all for B-wing. Phil Beckinsale was a former prison officer and he was interviewed where he spoke about the ghostly footsteps that he once heard at 2 in the morning, walking along landing 2 of the B-wing. He said he heard them stop and then the unmistakable sound of keys rattling. Like, there is no earthly reason why that sound of a disembodied prison officer going about his duties should be heard. It's pitch black. There is no one there, but he says he knows what he heard. C-wing also has its own ghost stories tied to it, and it is said to potentially have had a visit or two from the spirit of Ronnie Cray himself. 2 women were on one of the ghost hunts that Haunted Happenings host at the prison when they were in a cell in C-wing. They were just there, like they took a selfie, you know, kind of like capture the moment, and apparently they also captured something else. The ghostly hand of a man wearing a ring that looks uncannily like one that Mr. Ronnie Cray himself used to wear. The women were adamant that there was no one around them when they took the photo, so they had no reasonable explanation as to why there was this hand in the background of their photo. In another interview with a guy called Paul Toole, who was actually on the Paranormal Lockdown show with Nick Groff and Katrina Weidman, Paul told them the story that when C-Ring was under renovations for 2 months, there were 6 contractors in doing the work. Every single one of them reported seeing what they thought was a soldier walking up the corridor and disappearing out of sight around the corner to the right, which is weird. But Paul has another story to share with what happened to him in D-Wing, which is where the execution room is, as well as obviously like the condemned man's cell and the segregation and all of that. So in 2017, Paul is taking a group around on like a guided tour of the prison. Towards the end of the tour, he enters the condemned man's cell, talking about the prisoner's final few days before moving on into the execution room. So this is the first time that Paul is trying out a new story with the visitors, and it's a story of Private Lee Davis, who was the 3rd US serviceman to be executed. He was found guilty of the crimes of both rape and murder. He took 2 girls out in one night, one he murdered and one he raped. Absolutely awful. Paul had just got to the part in the story where he was telling the visitors about how Lee Davis would have been moved from the cell through the hidden doorway into the execution room, and he was reported to have said, "Oh my god, I'm gonna die." Apparently, Lee's knees buckled underneath him, and I mean, he was a bit of a mess. Understandable, knowing what you're about to go through. So the execution went ahead, Lee Davis was dispatched, but some say that his spirit refused to accept his fate and is now still roaming the prison to this day. But what was weird was, while Paul was telling this story, was that as soon as he said Lee's final words, the "oh my god, I'm gonna die" bit, he felt this super strong burning on his hand. He carries on like an absolute trooper, but after the tour, he looks at his hand and what looks like a cigarette burn is forming on his hand. You know, like that super clean, deep, almost like circular burn mark? What makes this story even more interesting was that apparently, according to Paul, Private Lee Davis was known as a chain smoker. And even now, Paul has a permanent scar on his hand. Like, you can see it clear as anything on him. So is it a weird coincidence? Or is it a spirit that doesn't like you telling his horrific story? So another area that is supposed to be super haunted is the old gatehouse, which I don't think I've mentioned at all yet. But basically, this used to be the entrance of the prison that they would use. Like, it would be where inmates were booked in and transported to their new digs. And then it had this like upstairs bit, which is where the gatekeeper would have lived. Apparently there have been like loads of instances of paranormal activity reported in this upstairs area, like strange unexplained noises and such, but couldn't really come across like any specific stories, even though it's apparently one of the most haunted spots. So if you do have one from the gatehouse, please let me know. The chapel also seems to be a bit of a hotspot for paranormal activity in the prison, as 2 staff members found out. So there were these 2 guides that were like going around unlocking a bunch of doors, ready for an evening of ghost hunting with a group. They were walking and talking, like on their way up the stairs to the chapel, when all of a sudden, the heavy chapel door was violently slammed several times. And this is a heavy door. Like, there is no way that it could have been like a gust of wind or some other explanation. And it gets weirder. The 2 guides were standing on the stairs, trying desperately to crawl out a rational explanation as to why the chapel door was being slammed, when they start hearing footsteps above them in the chapel. What? Absolutely not. No. No, thank you. But like, now they've got no choice. Now they have to go and investigate, just on the off chance that it's someone trespassing. But of course, they go up into the chapel. They're searching everywhere. There is absolutely no one up there. No gusts of wind, no open windows, nothing. But it seems that when the prison was running, the staff were getting it just as bad as the prisoners, as apparently the duty room has been the centre of some pretty nasty activity, along with drops in temperatures and the disembodied sounds of like heavy breathing. Some prison officers even report being attacked in that room. One officer that made these claims reported that apparently this thing had put an uncomfortably strong pressure on his neck. I'm sorry, but like, getting choked out by something you cannot see. And that's the thing here, like, the activity was getting so noticeable at one point. Like, in the 60s or 70s, officers were refusing to work the night shift. Like, prisoners were randomly freaking out in the cells. So the Home Office were asked to investigate what was going on, and they were there for 3 days investigating. And the results were inconclusive. They couldn't find an explanation for this. And the activity doesn't just seem to be tied to the buildings, as there have been some really weird happenings out on the grounds too. One of the ghost hunting groups that hires out the prison overnight were doing one of their like overnight dealios when they had a break for a bit. Two of the women that were in the group decided to just like go outside, get a bit of fresh air, when they saw an old woman sitting over to one side. She was wrapped in a shawl, sat on this brick wall, like shivering. Like this was the middle of the night. No one that wasn't on the ghost hunt should have been out there. So naturally, the women like think it's a bit odd and definitely too cold to be out there in the middle of the night. They went over to her to see if she was okay. As they approached her, the old woman stood up and started walking away. The women followed her, but she disappeared in front of their eyes. Like just completely dematerialized right in front of them. And there are other reports of figures doing this disappearing act. One time there was a visitor that was like taking a little walk around the wings when he spotted this really tall guy striding towards him on one of the catwalks. And this guy had a complete like, I mean business kind of aura to him. The visitor just like sort of got the feeling that this guy is not nice. You just know, when you just know in your gut about someone. So the visitor guy, he just sort of like steps out of the way like, all right, mate, it's yours. But as he turns to watch this tall figure strut past him, the guy just completely vanishes into thin air. Was it the echo of a prison officer going to raise hell with one of the unfortunate inmates? And that's the thing about Shepton Mallet. It just has so many of these stories. Like shadowy figures are commonly reported in the treadmill house when you can just like see someone out the corner of your eye, but when you look, there's no one there. But according to the former prison officer Phil Beckinsale, there is definitely something haunting that area. Phil was on the night shift, and part of that is that every hour you have to kind of do a bit of a circuit around the outside, make sure there's like no funny business going on kind of thing. He'd just reached the old treadmill block when he noticed that the lights on the top floor were on, which was super odd. Like there shouldn't have been anyone up there. And if the lights had just been left on, then he would have noticed them on his earlier rounds, like surely. So he goes up to take a look. There's no one up there, obviously, not a single soul. Okay then, that's a bit weird. He just turned the lights off, came back down and carried on his round. The next hour rolls around, he goes again for his walkabout. The lights on the top floor of the treadmill block, back on again. Okay, no. This is really weird. He gets on the radio to the other staff. Is anyone going up there and turning the lights on? Like, just let me know and then I'll know what's going on. Nope. None of the other prison officers are using it. So Phil kind of makes the smart decision to just go ahead and leave the lights on. Whatever is up there clearly wants the lights on tonight, so he's not going to get in the way of that. Totally understandable. So I do think with Shepton Mallet, there is so much potential for people to come back and haunt this place. Like, I mean, you've had the prison officers, like even the jailers from centuries ago, spending the majority of their time at the prison in this high emotion situation. And then of course you've got the prisoners living, suffering, and most definitely dying within the prison walls. And then, you know, like getting buried on the prison grounds. And I think all of that, it absolutely does leave an imprint on the place. And it's also funny that a lot of the activity seems to be directed at women. Female visitors to the prison often report the feeling of like their hair being pulled or unseen hands grabbing at them aggressively, which again sounds familiar, doesn't it? Men that have been locked away, sometimes for absolutely horrific crimes against women, wouldn't have seen other women very often. The behaviour just fits, doesn't it? Alongside all of this at Shepton Mallet, disembodied voices are heard having hushed conversations echoing around the prison. Footsteps seem to follow you through the wings. Cell doors will slam in the dead of night with absolutely no one around. And much like the thousands of prisoners that were holed up in Shepton Mallet Prison at one time or another, you always get the feeling that you're being watched, no matter where you are. In a place as old as this one, and the history of death and misery tied to it, it's not surprising that there are so many stories of weird encounters and unexplained occurrences. But what do you think? Have you ever visited Shepton Mallet Prison? Do you have any stories? Were you a former staff member or an inmate? Did anything unexplained happen to you? Please let me know your thoughts down below. I absolutely love reading other people's ghost experiences. When I first visited in 2018, like, this place was creepy. And maybe that had more to do with the fact that we were walking around this huge, great big hulking prison, pretty much just on our own. There was barely anyone else there. And there were just mannequins like dotted about the place, which was terrifying. One actually really did freak me out. But still, like, it does feel like it has a very heavy energy around the entire place that only really lifts once you walk out of the gates. As far as paranormal stories go, we didn't really experience anything while we were there, but that doesn't stop me from firmly believing that this place is 100% definitely haunted. Like, if any place was going to be haunted, a prison where people suffered and were executed, that would be it, wouldn't it? Obviously, there is so much history going on with this place that I could have talked for hours, and while it claims to be one of the most haunted prisons in the world, I'd love to hear even more ghost stories from prison officers and even prisoners themselves. It's a bit like how I feel with Ashwell Prison. Like, it would have been amazing to have more of those personal accounts. But anyway, please do let me know what you think. And if you're in any way interested in Shepton Mallet and you're down that neck of the woods, absolutely go and visit. Go on a guided tour to learn more about the place, go on a ghost hunt. And even like paranormal bits aside though, like they are really trying to make it into a big old heritage site, and for good reason really. Like, it's such an amazing example of a prison that tells the story of crime and punishment in England like throughout the centuries. But if you enjoyed this story, I would be forever grateful if you would hit that like button for me, and I'd love to see you back here for another story sometime, so maybe if you fancy it, you might want to subscribe. And if there are any haunted places or stories that you would like me to cover, please do let me know. I am always up for adding new places to my list and learning about more ghosts to keep me awake at night. But that is all from me today, so until next time, sleep safe. We just have to wait for the cat to get it out of its system. Oh, you just did one lap today? Oh no, you want to come back. I agree. Are you coming or what? Don't drink out of my